But it is good to be with you. I appreciate the invitation, and I appreciate the topic. He gave me the list of the things to talk about, and I was looking at that list, and the topic of depending upon God in times of conflict. And my first thought was, well, there is a topic I can relate to. And I'm sure that you can too. When we talk about conflict, when we talk about trials and troubles in life, it was Job that long ago, he said, man is of few days, but full of trouble. When you think about conflict and what conflict is, Webster defines conflict as a clash of opposing wishes or needs, an incompatibility between two interests. We would often call wars and battles, we refer to them as conflicts. When I was thinking about just that idea, I was thinking about how often in life we find ourselves in the middle of conflict. Because you can find conflict just about anywhere. You can get online these days and you find yourself very quickly in the midst of a heated conflict, a discussion that gets out of hand very quickly. You can go to work and find yourself in the midst of conflict. And sadly, sometimes you can even go to church. You look at the story that we read of in 1 Corinthians. It tells the history of that church and the divisions that were there. And couldn't that be defined as a bunch of people that are divided because of personal conflict that existed even in the body of Christ? Of course, we're told to endeavor to keep the unity of the Spirit and to avoid those types of conflicts in the church. In Joseph's story, and I'm glad that Joseph is the focus of this, because you really couldn't pick a better spokesperson for someone who has lived through conflict than Joseph. And the passage that I was given is Genesis 39. And we're going to be looking at Joseph in the middle of the conflict that surrounds Joseph and Potiphar's wife and what transpired there. But when you think of Joseph, his whole life could be defined by periods of conflict. And we're going to be looking at that as we get into this lesson and just talk about how Joseph found that conflict comes from all places. Sometimes it comes from within your family. Sometimes it's in the workplace. And sometimes it's even among your friends. And what we also see from his story is sometimes the greatest conflicts we face are from within. And the temptations and the things that lust against our spirit. I was thinking about Joseph also, and when you think of Joseph, and you think of his role and what God was bringing, Joseph has a lot of stories that we can tell about his life, but they're all leading to one place. God was bringing him to Egypt for a purpose, because God was going to protect his family and all that was tied in with it, as well as using Joseph as a way to protect and to preserve Egypt. And if you follow the story, you'll see that when Joseph finally ascends to that place God wanted him to be all along, his job is to prepare a nation for troubled times ahead. And I'm telling you, you couldn't pick a man with a better resume, because his whole life is marked by conflict and troubled times. And so he is a person that was able to lead and lead effectively, because by his 30th year, he had experienced more conflict than many experience in a lifetime. When we think about Joseph, I want us to think about how he faced conflict. And I know that Genesis 39 is my assigned topic, but I don't know what he talked about last night. So I'm just going to say that if we back up, it's okay if we tread over some of that same material. But what I want us to see about Joseph and conflict in his life is that he learned about conflict early on in life. He learned about conflict first in his home. If you go back into the story of Genesis, you see that they come from a unique family. We have Abraham and then Isaac and Jacob. Jacob is Joseph's father. When we think about that dynamic, when we look at their family setting, many people would look at what transpires in this family and they would say, that is a dysfunctional family. Because as we read through the pages and see all the flaws that they bring together in this family and all the mistakes that are made and the jockeying for position and showing of favoritism and all these things, we see mistake after mistake that is made not only by the parents but by the siblings and their relationship with one another. When we think of Joseph, we think of course, his siblings and the 12 sons of Jacob. Right off the bat, we see that this is a unique family dynamic because the 12 sons of Jacob come from 4 different mothers. When we look at that situation, we see a lot of conflict as well. In Genesis 29, we find out that Jacob is in search of a wife, and he goes there and he meets Rachel, falls in love with her, and he wants to marry her. So he enters to this contract with his future father-in-law, and it basically says, if you'll work 7 years for me, you can marry Rachel. And if you know that story, and we don't have time to get into the details of it, but Laban was a shrewd individual. Jacob ends up marrying Rachel's older sister, Leah. He's surprised when he figures that one out, and he comes back to Laban and says, you've deceived me. And Laban, of course, says, well, I couldn't let you marry the younger one without the older one being married. I tell you what, you work another 7 years and you can have her too. And he ends up right away with 2 wives when he was expecting 1. We have the situation involves more conflict from there. Because not only do we have now a conflict between Jacob and a conflict between his father-in-law and all the problems that arise because of that, but now we have Rachel and Leah in the same family, and Leah is able to have children, but Rachel is not. And there's a rivalry between them for the affection of Jacob. And Leah feels like she's winning the battle because she has more children and able to bless their lives in that way. And here is Rachel, whom Jacob really loves deeply, and she can't give him a child. So Rachel pulls a play out of Abraham and Sarah's playbook, and she comes up with this idea that she's going to give him, Jacob, her handmaiden. And so she gives to him Bilhah to be his concubine. And in Genesis chapter 3, we find that Genesis chapter 30, verses 3 through 8, we find that this happens. And so now we have a child or children that come from that relationship. Then Leah doesn't want to be outdone, and so she decides she's going to give Jacob her handmaiden, who is Zilpah, and she has children. Then Leah has more children, and somewhere along the line, Rachel finally has her children. She ends up having 2. The first is Joseph. The second is Benjamin. And she dies after giving birth to Benjamin. And so we have a situation that already, and we've just very, very lightly scratched the surface of that dysfunctional family. But Joseph comes into an environment of conflict. Conflict between the women in that family, conflict between the men in the family, conflict now between the siblings in that family. And now that Rachel has finally had children, and now Jacob's favorite wife has had children, guess what her sons become to him? They now become his favorites. And so now we have a different dynamic that arises in the family. It's the father's favoritism that is now fueling the conflict, the main conflict in this dysfunctional family. It was soon evident that Joseph, especially, was Jacob's favorite son. There's actually a very unique story, and sometimes we don't talk about it in relation to Joseph's story, but if you back up a few chapters into chapter 33, you'll find the situation where Jacob wants to reconcile with Esau. And if you remember, there's another story. We could talk about sibling rivalry. We could talk about jealousy, murderous rage. We could talk about, gypping one brother out of his blessing and deceit that was happening, and mother that was pushing one son forward, and father who had a different favorite. I mean, again, you go back another generation and there's a mess even there. But when we look at this situation, Jacob, who is now older and he has children and they have children, and he wants to reconcile with Esau, but the problem is he doesn't know how Esau is going to respond. He knows how wickedly he mistreated his brother, and he expects that his brother may still have a grudge against him. And so as he is coming to meet Esau, and Esau's coming out with all of his people to meet Jacob, Exodus 33 tells us that Jacob takes Rachel and her children and puts them at the back so that they're safe, and pushes his handmaidens and their his concubines and their children to the front, so that if there was a battle, his favorite children and his favorite wives would be protected. I'm telling you, Joseph's story is one of a family that there is open favoritism that breeds conflict, and so he understood that from his earliest age. From the earliest age. When we think of Jacob and Esau, Jacob should have learned. Jacob should have seen what the favoritism that his mother had shown him and the favoritism his father had shown Esau, the conflict that ensued, because he should have learned what that can do to a family and the relationships within a family. But as you read Joseph's story, as you look into the text, you see that Jacob seems oblivious to how his favoritism can be damaging to his children and the relationships between them. I want you to look with me in Genesis 37. If you back into Genesis chapter 37, it tells us in verse 2, it says, this is the history of Jacob. This is the history of Jacob. Joseph, being 17 years old, was feeding the flock with his brothers. And the lad was with the sons of Bilhah and the sons of Zilpah, his father's wives. And Joseph brought a bad report of them to his father. Now, there's a lot of debate, and especially in commentaries over this, of was Joseph tattling? Was this a negative attitude that he was exhibiting, or was he just giving a true report? Is it one of those things where he's like, hey, Dad, do you know what they were doing? Hey, Dad, let me tell you. We've all seen children who are tattletales. And we try to tell them, there is a distinction between being a tattletale and being one who tells when you need to. And that's the debate over this chapter is what do we see in Joseph here? Was he being kind of a brat? Or was he actually telling his father something that needed to be said? It's not that far off to think that these young men were up to no good, because if you read some of the other accounts that are surround this family, you see that often is the case. But nevertheless, it just kind of drops it. It tells us he gave a bad report. That's strike one. Things are adding up against Joseph. He's Dad's favorite. Now he's reporting on us, and they're looking at him kind of as Dad's spy. We look in this text, if you keep reading, it says in verse 3, now Israel loved Joseph more than all his children, because he was the son of his old age. Also, he made him a tunic of many colors. And when his brothers saw that their father loved him more than all his brothers, they hated him and could not speak peaceably to him. All right? Dad's favorite. Now he's Dad's spy. Now Dad is showering him with gifts. We need to understand that this wasn't 12 robes that were given to 12 brothers to honor them. It was one robe given to one son to single him out. He's not the oldest. He's not the one to inherit the blessing and the share. He's not the one that should have got this kind of gift. Commentaries will talk about, well, what kind of robe was it? The King James and New King James say a coat of many colors. Some versions say a robe with long sleeves. Many agree that this is probably a very expensive type of woven robe that had many different colors woven into it. It was something that would have made him stand out. And when the other brothers looked at their younger brother standing out and being singled out by their father, they were enraged against him because he was receiving preferential treatment, because he was clearly Dad's favorite. There's a statement that's made in this text that says that they could not speak peaceably to him. Peaceably is from the Hebrew word shalom, the word meaning peace. That was a common greeting of that day among this people. And so what it's saying is they wouldn't even say hello. They wouldn't even greet him in the right way because their hatred was taking root. And if we want to talk about this word hatred and think about how deep that really is, they're going to try to murder him very quickly. It's growing. There's conflict in this family. There was conflict among the father and his family. That conflict has now bled over into his own family, and he's making some of the same mistakes his parents made in showing favoritism that's putting brother against brother. He's making some mistakes of how he used Joseph and how he is singling him out in this context. And all that is happening is they are growing very tired of Joseph. If you keep reading, you'll find out, and again, we need to kind of move forward, but you'll see some other things that happen. Joseph has some prophetic dreams. in the dreams, his brothers are bowing down to him. Actually, it's not just his brothers. His whole family is bowing down to him. And even when Jacob hears this, when Joseph tells them, and again, is he being a brat again and telling them, like, listen, guess what I dreamt? Or is he just excited that something amazing has happened to him and he wants to share it and doesn't realize the implications? I can't answer that. But I do know that even when Jacob heard it, he said, does this mean that your mother and I will bow down to you? I don't think so. When we look at this context, we see that one thing is piled onto the next, that Joseph, he understands conflict because even at the earliest of ages, he's seeing it in his family, among people who were supposed to be those who loved him and supported him. We look at this passage and we see from this point on, in verse 10 it tells us that when his father and his brothers heard this, that his father rebuked him. But in verse 11 it says, and his brothers envied him, but his father kept the matter in his mind. Some versions say his brothers were jealous of him. Sometimes Joseph's story is likened to that of Jesus' story. There is one author I was reading just the other day that was talking about Joseph, and he said that Joseph is one of the most Christ-like individuals of the entire Old Testament. What he meant by that is if you look at some of the things that happened to Joseph and you parallel it to Jesus' story, you see a connection. In Joseph's story, he becomes the object of envy. His brothers envied him, just as many envied Jesus. You want to talk about why Jesus died? It's because the religious leaders of that day envied the crowds that were following Jesus. They envied him in many ways, and it led to his downfall, just as the jealousy and envy Joseph's brothers held toward him led to the way they mistreated him. He came to his own, his brothers, but they didn't receive him. He wanted to tell them something great. The Lord had given him this dream to tell him of things that would happen in the future, and they didn't want to hear it. What happened to Jesus when he went home to Nazareth? He says, a prophet's not without honor except in his own country. We look at the stories, we see that Joseph was sold by his brothers. Jesus was sold for some silver by Judas, one of his closest friends. Each was accused falsely by officials. Each was unjustly arrested and taken away. Each was numbered with transgressors. Each predicted future events. Each sat at the king's right hand. Each began his greatest work at age 30. Each dispersed bread to the multitude, and each was a savior of his people. The thing I want us to take away from that is when we think of the jealousy that was taking root in the hearts of Joseph's brothers, we need to remember that jealousy, that envy, bears deadly fruit. You think about it, who would harm Jesus? Jesus described himself as being meek and lowly in heart. And everything we read and everything we know about him, we see his beautiful heart. How could anyone harm Jesus? And yet when we know the story, when we think about what really happened, they plotted to kill him because they were jealous of him. Joseph's brothers did the same. You know the story. If you keep reading in Genesis 37, you'll see that Jacob tells Joseph to go check on his brothers. He goes to where he thinks they will be, and they're not there. There is a man that he meets that says, I overheard them talking, that they're in Dothan. And so he goes on and he tries to find them. As he's afar off, they see him, the text says. The dreamer's coming. They're mocking him. And by the time he catches up with them, they take him with cruel hands and they bind him and they decide they're just had enough. I'm tired of him being Dad's favorite. I'm tired of all these special gifts. You can almost imagine them ripping that coat off of him. All the things that he said just enraged them more. That's why they called him the dreamer. They had no respect and no love. They were only eat up with jealousy. And so they decide they're going to murder him, but Reuben steps in, the oldest. And I'm glad he had a little bit of wisdom. He decides that they shouldn't do that. They put him in a pit till they decide what they're going to do. Reuben goes off to do some other things, and while he's gone, some traders come by, and they decide that instead of murder, they'll settle for money. and they sell him into slavery. Can you imagine how Joseph must have felt? To be rejected, to be almost executed by your own family, by your own blood. We say family's not supposed to treat one another that way. And yet, don't we see, not only in the Bible, but haven't we seen even in our own lives at times where some of the people that treat us the worst, at times, can be those who are supposed to love us the most? Joseph understood conflict. He understood that idea when two are at odds. Because from the moment he came into the world, he was at odds with his brother, not for what he had done originally, but simply because he was his father's favorite. When we think about conflict, Joseph knew his share. We see from the get-go a dysfunctional family distraught by the favoritism of the father and jealousy of the brothers. And now Joseph is being cruelly swept away from everything he has known and loved. By the way, how old is Joseph? If you look back in Genesis chapter 37, it tells us that he was 17 years old. So when this portion of his story begins, he's just a teenager. And yet, his brothers hated him to the point they were ready to murder him and settled for selling him into slavery. So we leave the family of conflict, and we enter into another phase of conflict in Joseph's life. There's not much that's told of us what happens from the moment that he is taken into custody by these slavers and into Egypt. I don't know if they sold him right away. I kind of think that's kind of the way the story kind of pushes the idea, is that he's very quickly bought up and brought into Potiphar's house. But I can call this part of his life, this being sold into as a slave, a period of conflict, because we understand the nature of slavery, don't we? Even if it doesn't tell us many things at all about what Joseph experienced from the moment he was sold until the moment he was bought, we know that the very nature of slavery tells us that he was brought into an environment of conflict, an environment where he is immediately at odds with those who have purchased him, because he is now no longer a favored son. He is a possession with no rights. He has been a prince among his own people and treated now like a possession. Everything that he knows and has known is gone. And he's now immersed in this culture of people are no better than things. I'm telling you, Joseph knew conflict. He knew conflict in the home. He knew conflict at the hands of those who have purchased his freedom and brought him into servitude. And that conflict continues. We're going to talk about Potiphar. We need to turn over to Genesis 39. And I asked the question a moment ago, how old was Joseph when this story begins? And we find out from Genesis 37 and verse 2 that he was 17 when he had those first dreams about his family bowing down to him. He's probably not far off when he was sold into slavery. The question that I've always had, and the question I brought to this study, was how old is Joseph when the things that are transpiring in Potiphar's house? There's a couple of passages that at least give us a range of ages. In Genesis 41 and verse 46, we find out that when Joseph ascends to power in Egypt, where Pharaoh makes him his right-hand man, it tells us he is 30 years old. And so we can take from Genesis 37 to Genesis 41 is that period from age 17 to age 30. The only other time frame reference that I could find, and maybe you can do better than I did, but the only other time frame reference that I found was in Genesis 41 and verse 1 that talks about that he's in prison and he has helped the butler and the baker that are there in interpreting their dreams. And he tells the butler to remember him. And he says that he will. But it tells us that 2 years pass. Now, I've always thought that means that he was in prison 2 years. But after studying that, I'm not sure. Really, all that it's telling us is that 2 years have passed since the butler got out of jail, out of prison, and when he remembers Joseph. It doesn't tell us how long he was there. And so when I was asking the question, how old is Joseph, when we're reading about the events in Potiphar's house, I can't tell you how long he was in service to Potiphar. The story moves rather quickly that I think sometimes we're sucked into the mindset that maybe this happened very rapidly. Actually, I believe it probably didn't happen as quickly as we think. He was brought into Potiphar's house, and then at some point he is over Potiphar's house. And we have to just assume that somebody is not going to take a slave you know nothing about and put him immediately over your household. There has to be a time frame, at least, that you have a way of judging what he can do. I would also think there may be a language barrier because I don't know if Joseph spoke this language fluently or not. And so there are a lot of things that make me think there are probably a number of years that are coming by. So I say that to help us get ourselves in the right frame of mind. When we read of Joseph in Potiphar's house, he is somewhere between the ages of 17, 18, and 28. That's all I can say for certain. When I think of the encounter between Joseph and Mrs. Potiphar, I'd like to put him probably in his early 20s. I think that'd be kind of safe to say. Maybe it'd be better for us just to say he was in the prime of his life. He was young, and he was handsome, and he was well built. That's what the Bible tells us about this man. When we look into Genesis 39, it tells us that Joseph had been taken down to Egypt, and Potiphar, an officer of Pharaoh, captain of the guard, an Egyptian, bought him from the Ishmaelites who had taken him down there. And the Lord was with Joseph, and he was a successful man, and he was in the house of his master, the Egyptian. And his master saw that the Lord was with him, and that the Lord made all he did to prosper in his hand. And so Joseph found favor in his sight and served him. Then he made him overseer of his house, and all that he had he put under his authority. So it was from the time that he made him overseer of his house, and all that he had, the Lord blessed the Egyptian's house for Joseph's sake. And the blessing of the Lord was on all that he had in the house and in the field. And thus he left all that he had in Joseph's hand, and he did not know what he had except for the bread which he ate. When we look at this passage, we see an amazing story. It seems as if Joseph has arrived. His brothers wanted him dead. They settled for selling him into slavery. He doesn't know what the future holds. He ends up, by the providence of God, in this man's house, Potiphar's house. And he finds a place where he can prosper. You want to talk about prosperity? The Bible tells us that the Lord blessed Joseph. The Lord blessed Joseph's work. And the Lord blessed Joseph's employer, his master. That's prosperity right there. It's telling us how the Lord was bringing increase into his life. I want us to think for just a moment about who this person Potiphar was, simply because it's an intriguing study to me. In verse 36, chapter 37 and verse 36, it talks about Potiphar being an officer of Pharaoh and captain of the guard. We come into chapter 39, and it talks about the captain of the guard, an Egyptian, captain of the guard. What's really interesting to me is in chapter 40, we find out that of Joseph being sent into prison, the butler and the baker being put into prison, and they were put into the custody of the house of the captain of the guard in the prison, where the place where Joseph was confined. In chapter 39, in verse 20, it tells us that Joseph's master took him and put him into the prison, a place where the king's prisoners were confined, and he was there in the prison. Many commentators believe that the prison that we're talking about was actually the prison that Potiphar was over. That he served in really kind of as a warden. He wouldn't have been the guy down in the cells or in the dungeon, but he was kind of the guy that was in charge of this special prison. This prison is described as being a place where Pharaoh's prisoners were kept. And so this was the royal prison, probably a place kept for political prisoners, a place kept for people that were close to Pharaoh, like the baker and the butler. I keep wanting to say the butcher, the baker, and the candlestick maker, but I know that's not it. The baker and the butler. But when we see that this is no just regular prison that somebody would have found themselves in. And many believe that it seems as if the things that are describing Potiphar, that he had some connection to it, it may have been actually on his property, the way that some of these verses read. It definitely would have placed them in close proximity to the palace and to Pharaoh himself. Well, let's get back into the story. By God's hand, Joseph has come out of conflict. And he has come into some really amazing circumstances. Circumstances where he probably counted himself to be blessed every day. Because when you think of someone who lives as a slave, they have no control over their destiny, over their life, as in regard to where they will go and where they will work. They are at the whim of others. But God is directing Joseph's destiny. It's interesting to me in chapter 39, in the verses that we read there, it tells us that Potiphar saw something in Joseph. It's an interesting thing to point out because in this chapter there are going to be two visual evaluations of Joseph. And what I mean by that is it's going to mention two different people and what they saw in Joseph. In verse 3 it tells us his master saw that the Lord was with him and that the Lord made all that he did to prosper in his hand. And so Joseph found favor in his sight and served him. At first Joseph is just another slave in Potiphar's house. But it's not long before he's master over that house, second only to Potiphar himself. Because when Potiphar paid attention to Joseph, he saw something. And isn't it interesting? It doesn't tell us in his evaluation of Joseph what he saw. He doesn't tell us about Joseph's skill and things of that nature. It tells us about Joseph in relation to God. He saw that God was helping him prosper. I don't know about you, but I hope that when people look at my life, if they take a close look, they can see the connection I have to my God. I hope that when people look at my life, that they see that I first and foremost am a Christian. Because isn't that what it's about? Isn't that what we are supposed to be doing? Isn't that what God was calling us to in Matthew chapter 5 where Jesus in the Sermon on the Mount says you're the salt of the earth. But we can't lose our flavor, right? You're the light of the world. And you don't take a light and put it under a bushel. But let your light shine before men that they may see your good works and glorify your Father who is in heaven. Jesus is saying when we're living the right way and doing the right things, God will get the glory. I can't help but see that in this story, that Joseph is doing the right things and living the right way. And when Potiphar takes a look at Joseph, what does he see? He sees that God is blessing him. And therefore he trusts him in his business and in his house. We look at this evaluation and we see that Joseph was seen by someone, and when they saw him, they saw his connection to God. You want to know what will help you through conflict, through times of conflict? It's your connection, your relationship to God. We look at Joseph and we see that is key to his story. It is key to his story. Craig asked the children just a little while ago, what time is it? It's time to depend on God. And that's Joseph. That's the essence, the key of who he was as an individual. But as one has said, often the blessings of God are followed by the battles with Satan. Or I like this one. Someone has said, God's smile is often followed by Satan's growl. Isn't it often the case that when we have those moments of triumph and blessing, we need to look around because Satan is just waiting for an opportunity to ruin it? Here is Joseph in this situation. He probably never dreamed that it would be this good for him as a slave. And now we see that someone else is looking at Joseph. Remember, Potiphar saw Joseph and saw his connection to God. But another one is taking an interest in Joseph as well. Now, I stopped short in our reading in verse 6 because it tells us something. That last sentence of verse 6 tells us something we need to make note of. Now, Joseph was handsome in form and appearance. The NIV says, now Joseph was well built and handsome. We need to understand that. I don't think that this is something we need to just pass over, because there's something I found out as I was reading this, and I was thinking about something in connection with his mother. This statement that he was handsome in form and appearance is something that's said often in the book of Genesis, but it's hardly ever used in regard to a man. It's usually a woman they're talking. She was beautiful in form and appearance. Rachel was described in that way in Genesis 29 and verse 70. She was beautiful in form and appearance. Sarah was described in that way. Do you remember in these situations when they're describing the beauty of the patriarchs' wives, that their beauty is described in such a way that Abraham, even though Sarah was advanced in years, as they came into Egypt, he was afraid that some other man was going to take her. Can you imagine how beautiful she must have been? That even advanced in years, he is thinking someone is going to come in, they're going to kill me and take my wife. She's that beautiful. Rachel and others were in that category. We would say they were knockout gorgeous. The same terminology is used, and it's unique that it's used in regard to a man. Could we infer from that Joseph was handsome? Dare we say he was beautiful? He had everything you would desire, physically speaking. You know, it's interesting. We talk about Joseph and the connection that his life parallels Christ, but the thing that is told to us about Jesus' appearance in Isaiah 53 is that there is no comeliness in him that we would desire him. It was Jesus' inward beauty that drew people. It wasn't anything physical, but Joseph, he not only had a beautiful heart, but also a beautiful exterior. He was well built and handsome, likely in his early 20s. And God had blessed him in every way. And Joseph's looks drew unwanted attention from someone else. Just like Abraham was worried that Sarah's looks were going to draw unwanted attention. Just like Jacob didn't want Rachel to be seen because she would draw unwanted attention. Here's Joseph, and someone is looking at him, and they're looking at the outside. And here again we find conflict. The next verses read almost like a soap opera storyline. In verse 7 it says, and it came to pass after these things that his master's wife cast longing eyes on Joseph, and she said to him, lie with me. But he refused and said to his master's wife, look, my master does not know what is with me in the house, and he has committed all that he has to my hand, and there is no one greater in this house than I, nor has he kept back anything from me but you, because you are his wife. How then can I do this great wickedness and sin against God? There it is. Temptation has come into the picture. We see a different type of conflict here. We see conflict that is between this woman trying to seduce this young man to sleep with her. And how does he respond? I mean, we have to praise him for how he responds, right? He does everything right. He says, absolutely not. He gives a no, and he clarifies it and tells her exactly, point by point, why this is a bad idea. And yet, she will continue to come after him. It's interesting to me that we have seen two visual evaluations of this man. Potiphar saw one in whom God was blessing. Potiphar's wife looked only to the flesh. And what she saw and what she thought of was not of God at all, but of the devil. This conflict that we see is twofold. The conflict within this woman that we describe with words like lust and temptation, but also the conflict it creates for Joseph. Some of the greatest conflict that we will face comes from within and not without. If you look at 1 Corinthians chapter 10 and verse 13, we find a very powerful passage that teaches us about temptation. There are a lot of passages. We could look at James chapter 1. We could look at other passages in regard to temptation. But Paul would say to the Corinthians that no temptation is overtaking you except such as common to man. But God is faithful and will not allow you to be tempted beyond what you are able to bear. And He promises that when we are tempted, God will provide a way of escape. Here we find Joseph, and he has his way of escape. He says, absolutely not. No, I refuse to do what you are asking me to do. He passed the test. But what Joseph didn't realize at the time, and what the text reveals to us, is how strong that conflict was within this woman. Because if you go back into the text, you'll find out that she is focusing on the physical, and she can't let go of it. Even though Joseph has given her a great argument as to why they can't be together, and he won't even consider it, she just keeps looking at him. The idea that she cast her eyes on him. It's if you look up the terminology of that word, it's the idea that it's like a fisherman casting a bait, and she sees him, and she just sees something she desires, that she wants to go after, and she's going to go after it with everything that she has. She's persistent. Look at verse 10. So it was as she spoke to Joseph day by day that he did not heed her, to lie with her or to be with her. You know what that tells me? That after this first encounter, when he says no, absolutely not, she didn't take no for an answer. It tells us that every day she'd pass him in the hall. Joseph, are you thinking of me? She'd come, and he would come into the room, and she would come and probably do things to try to entice him, because every day she was after this one thing. Even though he said, I'm not going to do it, I'm never going to do it, she didn't give up. She was persistent. Doesn't that say something about the conflict that was within her, that inward battle, and she was just giving into that whirlwind within her, and she was trying to drag him down with her. Notice the conflict within her. She waited for a private moment. In verse 11, but it happened about this time when Joseph went into the house to do his work, and none of the men of the house were inside, that she caught him by his garment. She waited for an opportune time. In Luke chapter 4 and also in Matthew chapter 4, we find the account of Jesus being tempted in the wilderness. Luke's account ends that Satan goes away, but he adds this little clarifier. He says, he departed until an opportune time. If you read in Genesis chapter 3, the account of Adam and Eve, and when Eve is approached by Satan, do you think it was a coincidence that when Satan approaches Eve, that she's by herself? I don't think it was. Satan is an opportunist. Satan is looking for it, that opportune moment when we are by ourselves, when we don't have someone to support us. Here she is plotting, and she is planning, and she is waiting for that opportune time. No one's around. No one will ever know. But such things never crossed Joseph's mind. Notice the conflict within her. Notice her powerful grasp In verse 12 it says that she caught him by his garment, saying, "Lie with me." But he left his garment in her hand and fled and ran outside. That word caught means to violently seize. It means she grabbed a hold of him and she wasn't letting go. She's left with the garment in his hand. You ever try to dress a toddler that doesn't want to be dressed? Have you ever, parents, you try to, and you're left with that thing in your hand, that coat or that, because they're just wiggling out. I'm telling you. What Joseph does here is she grabs him with such force, she's like, "I finally got my hooks in you." And he wiggles his way out of there any way he can. He leaves his garment behind. There are times when we face temptation and we reason with it, like Joseph did that first time. But there are times when we simply must flee. That's what Paul told Timothy in 2 Timothy chapter 2 and verse 22. He said, "Now flee youthful lust." Flee, run away from it. When we look at Joseph, Joseph wasn't being a coward in this situation by running away from temptation. He did the smart thing, and he did the only thing he could to protect his morality and his purity. Now, from the world's perspective, did Joseph do the right thing? You keep reading, you'll find out she's going to accuse him of rape. She's going to cry bloody murder. She is going to have her husband punish him because he has rejected her and rejected her and rejected her, and now he's going to pay. It's interesting to me that it says she had his garment in her hand. If you look at that phrase, in the hand, at the beginning of the chapter it says that Potiphar had placed everything in Joseph's hand. It was a statement of his power in the house, the authority he held. Now she has the power over him, and you better believe she's going to use it. She's going to destroy him. But I'm telling you, even though he ended up in prison, he did the right thing. Better to end up in prison and face the consequences in this way than to lose one's soul. Notice also the mention of the garment. She's going to show this as proof that he tried to have his way with her. You know what hit me the other day as I was reading this? This is the second time in Joseph's life that someone has taken his garment and used it to prove a lie. Do you remember the first time? When his brothers sell him off to slavers, they take his beautiful coat of many colors and they tear it, and they take blood from one of the sheep and they put on it, and they take it back to Jacob, and they say, "We don't know what happened to Joseph, but we assume he was attacked by a violent animal and your son is dead." And they tried to prove that lie by placing the garment in Jacob's hand. Here's this woman that's saying to her husband, "He tried to have his way with me, and here's the garment, and here's the proof." It's the second time in his life somebody's used his own clothes to prove a lie against him. Verse 13, "So it was that when she saw he had left his garment in her hand and fled outside, that she called to the men of the house and spoke to them, saying, 'See, he has brought into us a Hebrew to mock us. He came into me to lie with me, and I cried out with a loud voice, and it happened when he heard that I lifted my voice and cried out that he left his garment with me and fled outside.' And so she kept this garment with her until the master came home. And then she spoke to him with words like these, saying, 'The Hebrew servant whom you brought to us came in to mock me.' And so it happened. As I lifted up my voice and cried out, he left his garment with me and fled outside. And so it was when his master heard the words which his wife spoke to him, saying, 'Your servant did to me after this manner,' that his anger was aroused. Then Joseph's master took him and put him into the prison, a place where the king's prisoners were confined, and he was there in the prison." Do you know what's always struck me as I read that? A slave acting in the way that he's been accused of, the punishment was immediate death. And yet he doesn't kill Joseph. And the Bible doesn't tell us whether that's God protecting Joseph or it's Potiphar not believing his wife fully. Maybe he saw that there was something fishy about this this story. I don't know if there's a lesson in that or not, but I hope that I would live my life in such a way before others that if lies are told about me, people would say, that just doesn't seem like the person I know. I believe that there's some of that happening in the mind of Potiphar. Joseph was able to handle a lifetime of conflict. And I believe this one event shed some light into how he did that. And very quickly, we'll wrap this up. How did Joseph overcome conflict? Number one, Joseph was acutely aware of God in his life. I don't know what kind of conflict you're going through. Maybe you would just say, I'm going through a trial right now. I'm going through the trials of life, the troubles of life. But I'm telling you, one of the ways that you will get through is keeping your eyes on the prize. Keeping your eyes on God and knowing that He loves you and that He knows what is going on and that He cares for you. One of the greatest statements of Joseph's awareness of God in his life is found in Genesis chapter 50, verses 20 and 21. He's speaking to his brothers who sold him into slavery, and they are asking his forgiveness, and he's granting it. But he says, "But as for me, you meant evil against me, but God meant it for good, in order to bring it about as it is this day, to save many people alive." There are times we have to tell ourselves we do not always know what God's plan is, but we do know who God is. And we know that He is a God that has promised to be with us and never forsake us. Hebrews 13 and verse 5, I will never leave you or forsake you. Isn't that a beautiful thought? In the life of Joseph, we see this attitude. The Bible tells us 2 times in this chapter, chapter 39, that the Lord was with Joseph. Conflicts will arise, bad situations, bad circumstances, bad people. It's how you handle it. You can't stop those bad circumstances, those bad situations and bad people from being in this world and encountering you in life. But you can handle it the right way. And it seems to me that Joseph handled every conflict that was thrown at him and was able to handle it correctly because he kept his focus on God and understood that God was ultimately in control. And this reality that God is in control helped him in numerous ways. First of all, it helped him not to give in to self-pity. How many times do people get into problems and they just crumble because I just can't handle this situation? But yet Joseph has an attitude that is much like Paul's that we read of in Philippians chapter 4, where Paul, facing whatever life could throw at him, would say, I can do all things through Christ who gives me strength. Paul would never give in to self-pity and self-doubt. He would never become bitter because his focus was on God and his relationship to God. Someone said, trials can either make you bitter or better. It's up to you. Joseph was one who never became bitter, but he approached every situation. If he found himself as a slave, the text bears out that he must have had the attitude, I'll be the best slave I can be. Isn't that a Christian attitude? Isn't that what Paul teaches us in Colossians 3, where he says, whatever you do in word or deed, do all in the name of the Lord. He speaks to slaves and says, you serve your master well, because you're not serving him, you're really serving him. And so that's the attitude that Joseph was able to keep because his focus was on God. Joseph did not give in to the emotions that could have drowned him, like lust or anger or resentment and self-pity, because his focus was upon his Father. Joseph was aware not only of God being there in his life, he trusted in the provision that God was giving and was doing for him, the blessings that God was heaping upon him. He knew that God had not kept him from these bad circumstances, but he trusted that God would get him through them. When we think about this, we see that Joseph constantly recognized the good that God was doing in his life. But not only the blessings that he received from God, what's very interesting to me is when Joseph is rebuking and resisting the advances of Potiphar's wife, one of the things and reasons he gives why he cannot do that is he is acutely aware of his blessings. In Genesis 39 and verse 9, he says, there is no one greater in this house than I, nor has he, Potiphar, kept back anything from me. but you, because you are his wife. You know what I've noticed about times of trial, times of conflict, whether it's inner conflict or outer conflict? We have a way of forgetting our blessings. You know, the situation between Joseph and Mrs. Potiphar isn't a unique situation. It happens around us in life every day, doesn't it? And many people who give in to adultery and fornication, they're not thinking about how many blessings they currently have. They're only thinking about the one thing they don't. And that's as old as sin. You can go back into Genesis 3 and you could see that God placed Adam and Eve in paradise. They had everything. They could eat of every tree of that garden. And yet Satan drew their attention to the one thing they couldn't have. Oh, how many people regret making decisions like Potiphar's wife wanted Joseph to make. And they say, what was I thinking? My life is destroyed for a moment of pleasure. I'm telling you, one of the things that helped Joseph overcome the conflict that he faced, he was counting his blessings. That God had blessed him, and even Potiphar had blessed. How can I do such a thing? And we would do well in our time of conflict not to focus on what we do not have, but be more focused on what we already have. Number 3, Joseph was aware of the nature of sin. She was telling him every day, lie with me. I'm sure there was more said and more done to convince him this will be a good time. This will be something you enjoy and you won't regret. And no one will ever have to know. But Joseph's response in Genesis 39 and verse 9, he says, how then can I do this great wickedness and sin against God? We live in a culture where people like to redefine sinful activities. I don't call it sin. That's kind of harsh. It's an alternative lifestyle. Oh, let's not call it this. They're just boys being boys and girls. Teenagers are just going to have fun. We like to make all kinds of excuses for sinful activity instead of calling a spade and saying what it really is. Joseph is saying, listen, this isn't a moment of pleasure. This is wickedness against God. And it doesn't matter how you dress it up, it's still sin. It's still deadly. And the consequences are too much. Joseph had an understanding of that. Why did he flee and leave his coat behind? Because he realized she had her clutches on him and he wasn't about to let anything happen along those lines. There are some hard decisions I think we need to make. I think sometimes we flirt with the line on things, and we need to make a decision and understand that certain things are just not for Christians to be involved in, and for Christians to do, and for Christians to participate in. See, Solomon said this in the book of Proverbs. He says, the fear of the Lord is the beginning of wisdom. And that's one of the things that helped Joseph overcome his conflict in life, no matter if he's dealing with his brothers or with Potiphar's wife. He had a deep respect for God. You know, in our culture, we barely respect ourselves, let alone God. People don't respect one another. We need to get back to understanding what the phrase fear of the Lord really means. We were talking about that the other night in our house. It's not saying that we need to live in terror of God, but really saying we need to live in reverence of Him. Joseph had a deep reverence for God, and therefore he was going to honor Him by the choices that he made. And in our modern culture and our modern religion, we see how much sin has penetrated and immorality has invaded because we have forgotten this foundation principle of Christianity, that there is such a thing as sin, and the wages of sin is death. That's how serious it is. It's so serious that the only thing that could affect it, the only thing that can erase it, was the blood of Jesus Christ, the Son of God. Joseph had an understanding of the reality of sin. Joseph, instead of seeing the one thing he didn't have, he saw the abundance of blessing he possessed. And instead of thinking, you know what, I'm alone, no one will ever know, he understood God was there because God had never left him in his life. And he was able to look back at his life and the things that he had done, and he was able to say, God has brought me here. Folks, where will we be if we lose sight of who God is and where God is in our lives? I'll tell you where you'll be. You'll end up like Potiphar's wife, living a life that is full of discontent, a life where you're constantly looking for something else to fill that void, even if for a moment. But the person in the story, that doesn't matter if his brothers are mad at him, doesn't matter if he's at the bottom of a pit or sold on the slavery block or at Potiphar's house at the best times or at the worst times. It doesn't matter where he is. Joseph was content because he wasn't believing Satan's lies. He wasn't chasing after fool's gold. He was trusting in Jehovah God. Joseph knew conflict, but he is a shining example of someone who reminds us our circumstances do not have to define us. Let's let our relationship with God define us.